Welcome to this month's edition of the Pigment 101 webinar series. We're happy to have you here. This month we are going to take a deeper dive into high-performance pigments and how they can help you in your formulation needs. This webinar is going to be recorded, and all of those in attendance today will get the link for the recording as well as the PDF. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to use the chat box and I'll address all of them at the end of the presentation. And just a little bit of forewarning, there's a lot of information that I've pulled together for this webinar. So some of the charts are quite busy, but I'll go through and highlight the important features as we go along, and then you'll have the opportunity to take a closer look once you get the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and then we'll go from there. So I'll go off camera here a little bit. Okay, so for high performance pigments, one of the things that I wanted to provide for you is really answer some questions that we all have with respect to high performance pigments and what they can do for you. And you as a formulator, you as a color designer, or even you as a procurement person. Because there are some interesting things to consider to make sure that the pigment choice is matched up with your specific need. So high performance pigments are typically pigments that have enhanced durability, whether that's light fastness or weather fastness. They also provide good heat stability and chemical resistance. The important piece to note is that cost alone is not a determining factor with the high performance pigments. You've heard the phrase that I use, value in use, often throughout our webinar series. And this is really important because the value of that pigment can differ depending on who is assessing it. And that who can be technical or it could be commercial. So they certainly see things differently, and it's my job as a support person to make sure that everything is understood properly for that pigment so that everyone can make the appropriate selection. However, sometimes the distinctions between pigment classes are not always clear and consistent. A good example are the copper phthalocyanate pigments, which exhibit excellent fastness characteristics like those of high performance pigments, but because they are have a more economical price and are used in a lot of lower cost applications, they tend to be placed into the classical pigment categories. And then within high performance pigments, there's going to be a broad range of durabilities, especially when you can compare organic and inorganic pigments. Speaking of inorganic pigments, one negative, if there is that there's just a much more limited amount of color space that is taken up by the inorganic pigments. So it's the combination of the inorganic with organic that allows the great performance as well as a broader color portfolio. So on the organic side, in each class of organic pigments, the polycyclic, the azo, and the metal complexes, there are high performance pigments. And we will take a little closer look at a big selection of these so that you can understand what they are and what they can do for you. On the inorganic side, the CICP type of pigments fall into that category of high performance, as well as Mica effect pigments. So I've used this chart many times just to get an idea of the differences between the high performance and the classical. As I mentioned earlier, light fastness and weather fastness are always in the middle to high range in terms of performance. And because they are more weather fastness, that allows you to use less stabilizing additives in your formulation. Heat resistance is high, allows for many more polymer substrates to be used in the formulations. Fastness of solvents and chemicals are always high. Pricing is on the higher side, medium to high side in some cases. However, some of the performance that you get will justify some of those higher prices. And as I mentioned, the phthalo blues and greens straddle the two classes. They have properties like high performance pigments, but they are priced more like the classical types of pigments. So when you're selecting a pigment, the biggest thing is that the pigment is only technically valuable if it performs the correct way for the application that you're selecting it for. So it's very important to match up the pigment to your application. In each market segment, there are some unique technical requirements. So it's important to understand exactly what's required of that particular pigment before the selection is made. In every pigment class, you're going to find at least one grade with higher performance characteristics than another. A lot of that is due to the finishing techniques that are used, which can shift the performance characteristics in one direction or another, depending on the choices made in the finishing. And then the degree of performance for the pigment always depends on the demands imposed on it for the intended application. So as far as the synthesis is concerned, we talked about this many times. About 75% of the performance really comes from the chemistry itself. And the remaining remaining performance is then shifted by either the chemical finishing, which is typically a surface treatment, or some other additive in the process, or mechanical with respect to what type of drying process is used, or a pulverization particle size reduction process. Each of those will shift the end performance for that particular CI. In the color selection process, it's a three-way design to be able to get the most successful choice made. It's a combination of the formulator, the product designer, and the pigment manufacturer. And the pigment manufacturer is there because we have the deep knowledge and understanding of the technology, and we are in a great position to be able to recommend the appropriate product for your application. So it's always going to be balanced. And in this particular case, when you are doing something from the start, or you're trying to improve it on a performance item, it's really important to have your priorities in line. So going through your must-wants and nice-to-haves is very important. And then from there, we can match up the pigment properties against those priorities to make sure that you have the best option for your formulation. So in the color space, the high performance pigments do fulfill the full color spaces. In this particular yellow color space, I have a number of color indexes on here. The red bold ones are the high performance pigments, and there is both the organic and the inorganic on these slides. So you've got on the green side, you've got a pigment yellow 138. That's one of the most green shade in that one. And then on the inorganic side, you have pigment brown 24, which is the most red shade for the yellow color space. In the orange color space, again, the pigment brown 24 kind of straddles both color spaces. So it's in the orange space, it's going to be the most yellow, while the pigment orange 36 is going to be the most red. And in the red space, the pigment red 254 is probably one of the more yellow ones, and then the red 122 is to the blue side. And green, a little less numbers of colorants to fill that space, but it does go from the yellow shade to the blue shade. And same for the blue space in here. So we've got options to cover the full space. And on the blue shade, the violet 19 is to the red side, while the violet 23 is to the very blue side. So now we'll take a closer look at some of these categories and to be able to get a little bit closer details. And so bear with me as I kind of skim through these and point out some highlights. As I mentioned, there's a lot of information here, so I want to be able to respect your time here. So the polycyclic, there's a lot of chemistries that fall into this category. I've used this chart in the past, so I will skim through it as we take a look at examples in each of these chemistries. So pigment red 177, the anthraquinone, is a mid to blue shade pigment. It is it does have good transparency, making it a good companion for effect colors and formulations. Anthraquinones are important. However, in today's scenario, there are very few that are industrially important. Pigment red 177 happens to be one of them. Another one is the pigment blue 60. One thing to note when using this pigment is TiO2 sensitive in weather fastness. So TiO2 is very has high photo degradation, and pigment red 177 chemistry is susceptible to that. So one way around that is to consider using a CICP, like a pigment yellow 53, to get that light fastness or weather fastness, as well as the a good hiding aspect of it. So as far as what a red 177 can do for you as a formulator, it does have very high strength. So there's an opportunity to potentially use less pigment loading in your formulation. The color shade is somewhat unique. So it's not easily achieved with other organic pigments. But in combination with inorganic pigments, it really does help improve the chroma of inorganic pigments in there. So it's also a good option for warpage in the plastics area. The next one in the polycyclic area is the violet 23. A very blue shade pigment. It's a very universal, useful pigment, and primarily for shading. It does have extremely high strength and chroma into it, so you don't need. It's one of those ones where a little bit goes a long, long way. That has a very useful position for that one. Its color position by itself is not accessible with other pigments. And one thing to note when you're formulating with this, especially in the liquid coating area, is it does have high surface area. So the dispersion demand is going to be higher than other organic pigments. What it can do for you, because of that very high strength, you can get away with a lower pigment demand to get what you need out of it. In terms of formulation, it does have a good role in white coatings to reduce the yellowness of those particular ones. So very trace amounts can really brighten the white coating. And also with respect to blues, a very trace amount can really increase that redness of a blue if that's the direction that you need to go. The DPPs, the Pigment Red 254, is another workhorse in all application areas. It's a more mid-shade red. This one too, this chemistry is TiO2 sensitive. And also in liquid coatings, it can be sensitive to flocculation. So the proper selection of various additives can improve that particular property. As far as when you're formulating with it, because it does have a neutral shade, it allows for minimal amounts of blue or yellow pigments to be used to shade it over to the blue side or the yellow side. As a mass tone, it does have good weathering, and it's fast for bleeding in plastics. The other DPP is the Pigment Red 264. This is a blue shade red pigment, similar in space to the Pigment Red 177 that I spoke of earlier. It's got a good usage in all coatings areas, or coatings in plastics and inks as well. From a formulation perspective, selection of the dispersant can really improve that strength area and really get additional value in that particular pigment. It does have a wide range of polymer suitability because of its high heat resistance and weatherability. This one is not impacted by TiO2, like the similar color space Pigment Red 177 that I spoke of earlier. Pigment Red 139, isoindolone, is a very red shade pigment. It's sort of a kind of an overall pigment primarily used in coatings. However, you can get a transparent version as well if required. The opaque itself version is going to always be redder in shade and is better for weathering and can be higher in loading, primarily because the particle size is going to be bigger. The Pigment Yellow 139 is sensitive to the weather, is TiO2 sensitive. This is a great area for something like a Pigment Yellow 53, which is in a similar color space. Or have another option to move to Pigment Yellow 110, which is not impacted by TiO2 and is in the same color space. The Yellow 139 also performs poorly when in contact with alkali, so your end application area needs to be taken into consideration. However, what it can do for you, it's a very cost-effective red shade pigment with good heat stability. The Yellow 110, the isoindolone, as I mentioned, is an option to the Pigment Yellow 139, where the overall weatherability is important. The Yellow 110 is one of the most light and weather-fast or yellow organic pigments that are known. So it's a very good overall red shade yellow pigment to have in your toolbox for that one. It's definitely has excellent heat and weatherability for all types of polymers as well. And it does come with an FDA compliance as well. On to the quinacridones, the Violet 19. In previous webinars, we talked about the two crystal types. The first one is the Gamma, which is the yellow shade version. This is another excellent pigment for overall good technical properties. It has high heat stability and does not migrate either. And it does not have an issue with respect to TiO2 either. So there's a lot of uses that it can fulfill in all application areas. The violet version, the beta version, again, has the same types of properties. The violet has a close color space to pigment red 88, which is on the classical side. So it offers similar color space, but more light and weather fastness. It does have a strong color to it, so again, there's additional value in use here because you might be able to use less pigment in your formulation to get the same results. The last Pinocchio, Pigment Red 122, is the most blue in shade. It's more of a magenta or pink is in there. It's excellent for migration and light and weather fastness, as well as heat stability. So overall, this is a great pigment. And as you can tell by the amount of products that Sudarshan has to offer, we have a variety of finishing techniques that we use across these products to be able to that result in a lot of different properties in here. So we can match up the technical requirements with a specific product. Pigment Yellow 138 is a very green shade, as I mentioned earlier. It is the most green shade yellow pigment in the high performance categories. This one can be in opaque or transparent versions. The transparent will be more green in shade. It is TiO2 sensitive. So this is another area where CICPs might be a good option to get that color space with weather fastness. On the liquid coating side, the Pigment Yellow 138 can chalk at high loadings with certain types of binders. So some additional formulation care will be needed in that specific space. What it can do for you as a formulator, this is the most green shade area, so it allows you to reach those color spaces, whether it be the opaque version or a transparent version. And it does come with a FDA, so that's always helpful, especially for plastics. Moving to the azo category, the benzimidazolones. The first one in the series is the Pigment Yellow 151. This is a green shade one, not quite as green as the Pigment Yellow 138, but it is pretty opaque, very durable for coatings and inks. And if you're looking for a high loading area, because it's a high particle size, it does allow for higher loadings. And it is good for plastics with respect to migration. It can be affected by strong alkalis. So again, the end application needs to be considered when choosing this type of pigment. Has good weatherability and does not warp with respect to plastics. And it also can be very useful for inks when a light fast and weather fastness it could be required. Moving to the red shade is the Pigment Yellow 154. It's more red than the 151. It's a real workhorse, especially in the coatings area. It can provide outstanding weather fastness and light fastness. It's not sensitive to TiO2, so that's one positive in there. On the negative side, it does have a lower strength than other organic yellow pigments. However, it does bring with it some additional properties that make it positive. From a formulation perspective, it's a very mid-shade yellow, so it allows for minimal use of other colorants to move it more green or red. And again, has good light and weather fastness. Continuing red is the Pigment Yellow 180. It's a very heat-stable pigment, and it doesn't impact the shrinkage of plastics. It's a it's a good alternative or option, I should say, for coatings like powder coatings and even in metal deco inks because of its high heat stability. In this particular case, diarylides would decompose in these kinds of temperatures. So it's an option to consider. And it does come with FDA as well. Orange 64 is a very yellow shade and very opaque pigment with great heat stability for plastics in there. It does have, again, for the same reasons, that high heat stability. It has value for powder coatings as well as potentially metal deco inks where those temperatures can be high. Um, Pigment yellow or pigment orange 64 has less weather fastness properties than the other orange, the orange 36, which will be next, and especially in tint tones. So something to consider when looking at oranges in this space. So it's very opaque and great heat stability as well. And then the last in the category is the orange 36. This is the most red shade in the orange space. It's a very useful pigment, especially for a coatings area. It is important to note that it is the TiO2 sensitive. So this is another great application for CICPs. In combination with quinacanones, you can get to a lot of the popular RAL shades like 2000, it should be 3000, 3002, and so on. But I caution those users is to make sure that you are not overgrinding it because it's a very soft pigment, so it can easily be overground to a dark and dull color. As a formulator, it offers that very red shade orange in color, and it gives that space that's required. And you can get around the TiO2 issue using some potentially CICPs to be able to improve that weatherability. And lastly, onto the metal complex for the phthalo blues and greens. So here's all the types of areas in here. We've talked about these in previous webinars as well. So the 15-1, the alpha blue, these are red shade in color. They're very strong in terms of the strength of the use, primarily in coatings and plastics. There are many flavors of pigment blue 15-1. Some can be stabilized through chlorination, and if that's the case, that you'll see a greener shade, but with less strength, but with more red to green flop. It should be noted that if you are using it for an exterior coating or plastic that is not have a clear coat over top of it, it is susceptible to acid rain, where the color will shift considerably. So our suggestion is to move that particular formulation to a pigment blue 28, which is not susceptible to acid rain. So it's a very useful pigment for all application areas, and it does provide some economical formulation space. And of course, with the FDA, it is also helpful. The coatings grade, the 15-2, is primarily used in the liquid coating areas to provide non-flocculation and resistance to rub outs in here. So it's a very useful pigment for the liquid coatings, especially because it does disperse very efficiently. And then shifting to the beta version, which is the green shade in color. Again, very, very useful pigments. There's a wide range of available grades, as you can tell by the number of products Sudarshan offers in all these different areas. Again, same idea that I talked about earlier, where the finishing techniques chosen can shift those performance areas. These are the whole CPC blue class of pigments are not going to be stable for acid rain, so this is another area where the Pigment Blue 28 can be helpful. And then lastly, the 15-4 blue is the most green in color space. Again, primarily used for liquid coatings because of its good flocculation and rub out resistance. However, we've found some good performance with respect to plastics and have offering a low warping option for this one. On to the green 7, same chemistry as the blues, just with a lot of chlorines on the end. It's a very symmetrical crystal, if you are one of those visual types like myself. These offer yellow to blue shade in color. There's only one crystal modification for this, so what you see right there is what you're going to get. It's got superior light and weather fastness. Interestingly enough, it is not susceptible to the acid rain like its blue counterparts are. So it's well used in those kinds of scenarios. One thing to note that if you are comparing the strength of the straight green 7 to something that is made from a CPC blue and another organic yellow, the strength of the straight green 7 will be less than that. However, it does offer its own properties that make it very useful in there. And again, the finishing techniques can offer a shift in properties based on what you're looking for. On to the inorganic pigments. We'll start with the CICPs in here. So these are truly high performance pigments, primarily because they are produced at very high temperatures. So they are truly a high performance pigment because of that property. And however, the one negative, if you can call it a negative, it will have much less strength than the organic pigment in a similar color space, but it comes with a lot of other very positive properties. Yellow 53 is the greenest in the rutile lattice structure collection of pigments. It's a light yellow in color. Being inorganic, it's very opaque and to visible light. It's very well suited for high temperature coatings. And then a good use for this is to combine it with the red and violet pigments that I spoke about earlier, the organic pigments. That opens up a wider range of durable and opaque colors. It's FDA approved or compliant so that we can use it in a lot of different applications. And as I mentioned in many of the slides earlier, it is a great option for replacing some or all of the TiO2 to be able to improve weatherability. Moving redder in direction for the rutile CICPs is the brown 24. Extremely useful pigment in all application areas, well suited for high temperature coatings, and it also is very suitable for coloring cement and lime in there. So think of pool deckings and garage painting as well. And continuing even redder, if you will, is Pigment Yellow 164, although it's a misnomer because the color of it is so brown. It's a very interesting dark brown color. It's a wide variety of polymer usage in for this particular one. It has a very interesting property where it's a very neutral pH, so it's a potential replacement for iron oxides where the organic pigments in the formulation that might be sensitive to pH. This is a good replacement, potential replacement for those. And the other property that is kind of interesting is iron free. So for pigment, for PVC window frames, it doesn't have that attribute that you can find with iron containing pigments. Pigment Yellow 119 is the first one in the spinel structure category. This is a very nice tannish color. In there, it is a good combination, a good pigment to use with other organic pigments to be able to get some very specific color spaces like bright reds and chocolate browns, light beiges to offer a high opacity as well as good durability. This one, like the Pigment Yellow 164 I just spoke about, it has a neutral pH, so it's a good replacement for iron oxides. And our product, the is FDA compliant via a letter of no objection. The Pigment Black 28 is in the spinel category as well. It's a bluish black in shade and color, opaque, of course. And although I don't like to compare it to carbon black, I will in a couple of scenarios. It doesn't flocculate like a carbon black would in liquid coatings. Certainly well suited for high temperature coatings and glazes and coloring cement. It's also FDA approved, and it does have that NIR reflectance so that you can replace your carbon black for plastic sorting in there. So that's an important thing as we try to recycle as much as possible. Right now, the detection systems have a hard time. They can't see anything with carbon black in it. The Pigment Blue 28, also known as Cobalt Blue, is a very interesting pigment, red shade in color. This too, like most of the all the CICPs, is suited for high temperature coatings and glazes, and suited for coloring cement and lime. Think about pools in here, so it gives a good shade to it. It is opaque, so it potentially offers a lower pigment loading and single pigment option for your formulation. As I mentioned, it's an alternate for the CICPs for both warpage in plastics and acid rain resistance in coatings and plastics. And the cobalt green is pigment green 50. So like its counterpart, it's well suited for high temperature coatings and glazes, uh, for coloring cement or applications associated with cement. So here, think rebar going into cement in there. This is a good option for that one. And like the blue, it being an opaque green shade with one pigment, you have the potential of have a lower pigment level loading with a single pigment. And then lastly is the mica effect pigments in inorganic category. Certainly by their nature, they're going to be high performance because of the mica itself, as well as the metal oxides that are put on there to get the color. And as we've talked before in previous webinars, the coating thickness will define the color. The mica size will define the sparkle brightness and how much coverage that you get. And in a lot of cases, it's a combination of multiple sizes to optimize these types of properties as well. And then the substrate you choose will define how much chroma, sparkle, and of course formulation cost is that you will receive from that particular pigment choice. Micas can be surface treated for different types of reasons. In the silvers or the TiO2 coated ones, as we've talked many times, the photocatalytic degradation of the TiO2 is important to consider, especially in the very, very fine particle sizes of the silver micas, and when there is not a clear coat over top. These might require some additional surface treatment to be able to combat that degradation of the TiO2. In water-based type formulations, because these pigments have such a high aspect ratio and are hydrophilic, they may not be able to wick properly. And so when the moisture comes out of the film, or goes into the film, there might be some wicking action caused by the mica and the water associated, which can lead to a deterioration of gloss. Of course, there are many color and size options with the Sudarshan portfolio of mica pigments. So there's many here to offer for your formulation needs. And then lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge our North American team. We are all here to help you with any questions that you might have or any support that you might need. You can reach out to any one of us and we're here to help. So next up is actually in May. We will be skipping the webinar in April because we have the 2024 North or American Coding Show in April, at the end of April, and so we will be busy preparing for that show there. So we hope that we see some of you there, and look forward to talking to you. In May, we will take a good look at Pigment Red 50 or 48, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in all application areas and do some comparing and contrasting on those types of pigments. And then in the future, in June, we will take a look at the chemical and physical characterizations of pigments and how they can help you in your formulation needs. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to join to give us for the webinar series, and we hope that you also take away something new each time. At this point, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have.